going to just kind of approach the film from the point of view of where this sits with Ernst Lubitsch's life and career, and then Brackett and Wilder's career. And so we'll start with you. Thank you, Devin.
All right, thank you, Tom. All right, and I'm on, right? Yeah, great. Hello, everyone. I think Donald is a great authority on Brackett and Wilder, so I'll give kind of a quick rundown of who this director Ernst Lubitsch is, because it's, I think, a terrifically interesting story. Hopefully I can convince the rest of you it's interesting too. So Ernst Lubitsch was a Russian-Jewish director who ended up moving with his family to Germany. His family moved to Germany, and then he was born in Berlin. And the first part of his career, and the majority of the films he made, this is often not, I think, not really highlighted enough, but the majority of his films were made in Weimar, Germany, between the years of 1915 and 1922. So that's about 40 movies he made in that time period. He made many, many shorts, a number of features, and during this time, by the time he left Weimar, Germany, he was arguably the most famous director in the world, not based in Hollywood. His film Madame du Barry was one of the biggest hits of 1919, 1920, and that was a fully German production. It was actually a little easier to localize films back then because they were silent, and you could just replace the title cards and no one would realize that none of the cast could speak a word of English. So that was a nice little benefit. He ends up he gets invited by Mary Pickford, in particular, to move to Hollywood, where they made a really great film, Rosita, together. He then proceeds to, kind of the long and short of his career between then and around the mid-30s is, by the year 1935, he has achieved such a position of prominence, making everything from historical epics to romantic comedies, that he was made the first and still only director in Hollywood history to become a studio executive. He was the production head of Paramount for a year. It didn't go well. It didn't go well. That's why you don't make great genius directors a studio executive at your studio. Many reasons were given, and Ernst himself would argue till his dying breath that he should have been given a better chance. But either way, in the late 1930s, Ninotchka was released in 1939. Lubitsch was in something of a rut. His last major big hit was in 1932. So it had been a while since he had made a kind of a critical and popular slam dunk. His first collaboration with Wilder and Brackett was the film Bluebeard's Eighth Wife. And if you haven't heard of that film, that probably speaks to its cultural imprint. That was his first attempt at a screwball comedy, which is a genre that you can spend hours debating what a screwball comedy is. But after that came this film, Ninotchka. And so, the story of how Lubitsch came to make Ninotchka is a really interesting one, because you can't talk about Ninotchka without talking about a project that was really close to Lubitsch's heart. It's a project that he spent years trying to shepherd through. He shopped around to different studios. MGM, the production company behind Ninotchka, ended up making a deal with him. They said, okay, you can make this film, but you have to make one for us first. And that film, the film that Lubitsch really wanted to make, one of his passion projects in life, was named The Shop Around the Corner. Ninotchka was the one for them. So I think that speaks to how great Lubitsch was, that this is his hack work. This is the film that he banged out, a Greta Garbo vehicle, so that he could do the film he really cared about. And the fact that it turned out to be a masterpiece is, I think, a testament to Ernst Lubitsch, and also to the two writers who ended up doctoring the script so much that they ended up being the kind of key creative forces behind the script, who are Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett. And Donald, do you want to give us the rundown on them?
I will. He could really bang out those classics, I'll tell you. Well, first of all, I think we've established that there are two kinds of people in the world. The people who stay home and watch the Super Bowl on TV, and the people who go out and watch a 1939 film like this. But many thanks, mutual thanks, to Tom Charity and the Film Festival crew for screening this marvelous film and for inviting us to say a few words about it. Devin is, of course, the Lubitsch guy, and I'm the Brackett and Wilder guy. I like the way Tom characterized his, what he called a quixotic quest. It's actually more of an obsessive quest, but I salute his compulsion for Lubitsch and all 43 of the films, because he's a monument to Hollywood and international filmmaking. My book focuses on these two incredible screenwriters and eventually producer and director team. They made 13 films together, the first two being these two Lubitsch films. And I maintain that if they hadn't met Lubitsch, they never would have worked together. And if Lubitsch hadn't been the kind of person he was, he somehow found a way to act as a buffer between these two individuals. Because you might think, having just seen one of the sweetest, most charming romances with such incredibly sparkling dialogue, that it must have been great fun to write this. In fact, the exact opposite was the case, because Brackett and Wilder mixed about as well as oil and water, and they were literally thrown together one afternoon in 1936. Manny Wolfe, producer at Paramount, waltzed into one or the other's office and said, "Brackett, I want you to meet Wilder. Wilder, this is Brackett. You're now a team." And essentially, they were just assigned these projects, the two Lubitsch films. But if you're going to be forced into working together, you could have less good fortune than it being the first Lubitsch. They, of course, won or were nominated for 4 different Academy Awards for this film, the screenplay being one of them, the story being another. I'm curious, no matter how many times I see this film, and that's quite a few, probably like Devin, it never ceases to be, I end up being verklempt. Does anybody know the word verklempt? It's what Lubitsch would say being emotionally overcome is, overwhelmed. And at least 4 times during the film, I was fighting back tears. And I'm trying to ask myself, why? You're a relatively old guy. What are you almost weeping at here? Was anybody else doing that at all during different moments? It's not only tender, romantic, poignant, hilarious, of course, but I guess the first time I saw this film, I was about 10 or 11 years old. I was watching on television at home. I was flu, or pretended to have the flu off from school, and I was watching the CBC matinee programs they used to put on. And this came on, and then I saw Charles Brackett's name, and I thought, well, that's my name, our name. Who is this guy? That was followed up by seeing each of the other films they made together, produced and directed eventually. And I believe I took literally what the singer-songwriter Van Dyke Parks, one of my favorite writers, said about movies. He said, movies are magic, period. And I took that literally. And when you're 10 years old and you're looking at Greta Garbo and eventually all the way through the masterpieces they made together, you realize that there's a strange magic in terms of this particular partnership. Because right away, they didn't just disagree. They could barely be in the same room together. They fought constantly, physically fought, through telephone books. And the cover of my book has Billy Wilder strutting up and down the office while Charles Brackett is lounging on a couch. His shoes are off, and he's just casually trying not to be hurt by Billy Wilder. Wilder's walking around whacking things with his walking stick, and they're just screaming. How do these films emerge from this kind of friction? One of the things I recall thinking, especially in Devin's description of how the films came about, the 2 Lubitsch films, the first of the 13, what makes a film a classic? And I think everyone has a different definition, but everyone is correct, no matter what year they're choosing. But a classic to me is something that doesn't get old. It becomes more beautiful, it becomes vintage, and whatever it is that the film has, it impacts different audiences, young audiences, old audiences, if they're open to it, if they let themselves embrace the feelings in it. And the kind of guy Lubitsch was, I think first of all, he was born the same year as Charles Brackett. And Charles Brackett, by the way, is the cousin of my great-great-grandfather. Both born in 1892. So they were both 52 years old, I think it was, when they were introduced to Billy Wilder, who was barely 30. Billy Wilder didn't really speak English at all. In fact, he'd been at Paramount Studios, where Brackett was also working, but for a much longer time than Wilder. And he was using the dictionary to make scripts, and he was using a translator to actually help him. So I think the studio heads, the thing was he was a visionary, and he was Billy Wilder. He was very forceful, he had a huge ego. And they needed somebody to ameliorate his rough edges. And as he went on in his career, those rough edges were no longer being ameliorated by a Brackett. The second writer he worked with, Diamond, of course, guided him through those rough waters. But I like Lubitsch's attitude. He said, in Hollywood, we always acquire the finest novels in order to smell the leather bindings. And that is something of his down-home, folksy attitude. He wasn't an intellectual director, but he made these remarkable works of art. And in fact, I think it was John Ford who said that we all thought we were just making entertainment for the moment. Lubitsch knew that we were all making art. And that's really what launched Billy Wilder in particular, who was mentored by Lubitsch, and Brackett was mentored by him too. And I had access to Charles Brackett's personal diaries when I was writing this book, which was quite remarkable because what he was writing about on a daily basis after 1936, working towards the making of this in 1939, all the way up to the very end of their career in 1950 with Sunset Boulevard. He was in meticulous detail, but not very poetically, describing what was going on in the daily machinery of making movies. And one of the things he said, I think, is particularly telling about how he worked with Billy Wilder and what Lubitsch knew about the two of them. Lubitsch knew that they despised each other. And I use that word literally. It's now the stuff of legend, what they were able to make, the kind of films they were able to make. 3 films after this with Mitchell Leisen, one with Howard Hawks, and The Lost Weekend with Ray Milland, won an Academy Award, and eventually Sunset Boulevard. But the technique they had was quite remarkable. Charles Brackett said in one of his diary entries, the thing to do was to suggest an idea, only to have it torn apart and despised. In a few days it would be apt to turn up, slightly changed, as Wilder's own idea. Once I got adjusted to this way of working, our lives were much simpler. I mean, so a question I have for Devin is, so many Lubitsch films, 43, and so many different styles, what do they have in common, if anything? And how did he relate to screenwriters of this stature to get this work out of them?
It's an interesting case because if you watch any number of Lubitsch films, especially from his Hollywood era, you start to realize something. All his characters talk and act like he did. He was a very, very German man. He never spoke perfectly uninflected English. He had a famous accent. You can hear it he played himself in a few radio plays. It's pretty entertaining. He had this full Teutonic accent. And you can hear his characters speak like him because he actually insisted on every take. He would walk through the entire scene, acting out every role. So every time you see Melvin Douglas in a love scene with Greta Garbo, he did that once with Ernst Lubitsch. And vice versa. He would sub in for both of them to give them their kind of idea of the scene. And this is a real natural extension of Ernst Lubitsch's working style, which is that he had a collaborative hand in every single aspect of the making of his movies. From the script, he had a similar way of working with his usual collaborators, such as Samson Rafelson, who wrote 9 films with him, as Wilder and Brackett did in some key ways, except in Lubitsch's case, they didn't apparently despise each other. Lubitsch was apparently a very easy person to get along with, famously so. He called it kibitzing, where they would just argue vigorously, and as Samson Rafelson said in his eulogy for Ernst Lubitsch, then they would have dinner, and it would all be great, like a family dinner, and you could not talk about the movie. So, which is a nice way of working. And this also applied to the editing room, where Ernst Lubitsch was one of the very few directors in Hollywood who was always present in the editing room, always directing the edit. Billy Wilder called him one of the great kind of directors of writers. He could make a topper, like Wilder credits him with The Hat. coming up with that idea, coming up with kind of, the last little absurd point that would push scenes over was often Lubitsch. Samson Rifleson called him one of the great writers, even though he wasn't a writer. He said that if William Shakespeare had worked with Ernst Lubitsch, Shakespeare would have made even greater plays. And so he had this very, very specific way of working where his personality would kind of filter through the films. And part of what I find so fascinating about Ninotchka is that you can see an equal amount of Wilder and Brackett. All of Wilder's works. I mean, Wilder idolized Lubitsch so much that he had a sign, which you can see in the Berlin Film Museum, that says, "How would Lubitsch do it?" And he had it hung above his desk for the last few decades of his career.
Which is the name of Devon's podcast.
Yeah, that's a plug. Yeah, no, and so Wilder would even go so far as to recycle stuff from this film. If you watch one of my favorite Wilder films, which is 1, 2, 3, you can see bits from this film, mostly Soviet Russia bits, taken wholesale. Even little things like tourist ticks, like the kind of the fact that Melvin Douglas is a kept man, is a constant in Wilder's career. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Donald, on the intersection of Wilder and Brackett in this film. How do you see them?
Well, I think that strange magic they had allowed them to both work with Lubitsch with an equal sense of awe, respect, almost adoration, as you put it. They were both mentored by him. They had a severe jealousy of the attention that Lubitsch would pay to either Brackett or to Wilder. And when they were fighting with each other frequently, Wilder would switch to German, of course, and the Yank Brackett had no idea what he was saying, but he would be able to converse very easily back and forth. And he would do this literally to torment Charlie. One of their techniques in dealing with the studio heads in general, not necessarily Lubitsch, who they both got along with well, was to work late in the day, so no studio heads, producers could come in and bug them, ask what they were doing, ask to read scripts. They were working very late in the day and often at night, and they would work often at Lubitsch's home, where they socialized. And one time, Brackett, one of his diary entries, points out that he noticed that Billy Wilder and Lubitsch were dressed in the identical clothing. He had a cardigan that was like Lubitsch's, he had tan trousers like Lubitsch's, the same shoes, and he said it was an unnerving and spooky realization. And so each one of them thought Lubitsch was paying too much attention to the other. This really just brings us back to the impossibility of them ever working together at all, Brackett and Wilder. And it's a miracle to this day, how they went on to make 13 other films, indeed Academy Award-winning films, culminating with Sunset Boulevard. But of course their career is completely fractured with Sunset Boulevard because it was so much, so intense, so much about Hollywood. They had to keep it a secret. They didn't tell anybody what the film was about. They gave it a funny name, Can of Worms, so that no one would know that it was basically an expose of Hollywood. And they both went their separate ways. And Walter Reich, who was the co-writer on Ninotchka, and has to be given credit for some of these snappy dialogues, he worked with Charles Brackett after his divorce from Billy Wilder, and it really was a divorce, because Wilder described their relationship, starting with Lubitsch, as being more intimate than a marriage, which is kind of scary. And one of the funny stories about the making of Ninotchka is Charlie Brackett, although he was gay, had a very great fondness for Greta Garbo. And he used to hang around watching her do her performance, watching her read the screenplay and so forth. And Lubitsch and Greta Garbo began to be unnerved by this. And Lubitsch had a screen set up, like a partition set up, to block off wherever she was performing. And Bill Wilder came in one time. He thought he had a right to be there because he was one of the co-writers. He wanted to make sure all the language was correct. Of course, he just adored Greta Garbo too. But he found Charlie Brackett down on his hands and knees, looking underneath the partition, ogling Greta Garbo, who I guess is very ogle-worthy for sure. Brackett, according to Billy, was sort of a country gentleman, he said, with political beliefs to the right of Herbert Hoover. I was for Roosevelt and the New Deal. Brackett and I didn't think the same way at all, and it's this difference of opinions that makes for good collaborations, up to a point. of course. He said sometimes we would argue violently, but that was good. That was how we got along. Brackett forced me to think in English, especially when I argued with him, which was quite a lot. So I think Lubitsch encouraged this competition between them. He took advantage of that relationship in a very self-serving manner, but in a avuncular, benevolent manner. But he realized that he had two extremely brilliant writers on his hands, writers who would eventually get tired of producers telling them what to do with their screenplays, changing the language when they wanted to let an actor or actress just improvise. They got really fed up. So, starting in 1941, they not only were co-writers, which they continued doing impossibly, but they were also producer and director. So it enhanced, amplified that angst they had together. So the rest is a complete miracle how they pulled this off. But Lubitsch was a blessed beginning for them. And I think he mentored them both to such a degree that he really, I think, set Billy Wilder for certain onto the road to being Billy in a fantastic way. And I think this film, it's very simple, but it touches on a nerve, a human nerve. The other weird thing about it is, remember 1939, I think it was 4 months before the war was declared officially, very close to the declaration of war. So this is all, underneath all of that silly dialogue, which I think is incredibly well crafted, phenomenally funny screwball comedy, and very sophisticated, sparkling dialogue back and forth. There was this ominous tone, of course, and the film frequently veers into rather strange, dark territory because, the satire about Russia, the political oppression and so forth, was quite heavy-handed. It wasn't very subtle. In fact, one of the weird things about this film is it was the favorite movie of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, because he called it an anti-Soviet film. And I guess it is an anti-Soviet film, but what it more is a pro-human, pro-Yankee, you could say, sensibility film, because in the end, everyone is perfectly happy to get out of that oppressive regime. But I think it took a great deal of chances and risks, and I'm quite amazed that they were able to get away with this degree of political satire, disguised as a screwball comedy, a romantic comedy. But it definitely was a launching pad for both of their careers, including all of Billy Wilder's magnificent later films, in which I'm pretty sure he frequently asked, how would Lubitsch do it? And I think he often did it the way Lubitsch would do it. Billy didn't have the sense of fun that Lubitsch had, or even that Howard Hawks had, another director that mentored him. But I think he was a visionary and a genius, despite being an extremely insecure individual. Maybe not speaking the language, coming to Los Angeles, and being paired with Brackett, who was 12 years older, 13 years older than him, was a way of sort of corralling or harnessing this genius, because he had only made a few films in Germany, in Berlin. And I think he was recognized, to begin with, Lubitsch realized that there was this firecracker, as he called him, in the Paramount stable, as it was known at that point. And he gravitated towards him, and the rest we saw on the screen. But, what makes a classic, though?
What you said about the politics of the film is interesting, because one of the most notable things for me about the film is that the film never asks Ninotchka Yakashova to renounce her beliefs. Right, she ends the film a committed socialist. With what her arc is, she learns to essentially incorporate her own desires and feelings into her political system and to achieve love with that. And likewise, Leon's arc is finding meaning for his life, right? And he finds meaning in expressing his love for this amazing person he's found. And I love the way that they influence each other. But almost, the film's politics are this almost, the question of communism or capitalism seems almost it's like tangential to the film's politics. The film's politics seem to be, how can we become happy, fulfilled people and be in love in a world that's kind of falling apart.
Yes, how can we have fun in the midst of tragedy of the world history? Melvin Douglas is just an incredible actor. I mean, he was just sparkling, scintillating. He doesn't really seem like he's memorized lines, reading lines. It literally belongs to him. His personality is so sharp. Now, Garbo was a special case. She had been adored for many years as exactly the kind of woman that's being portrayed there. Rather monotone, melodramatic, silent films, and then talkies. But the weird thing is, after this film, Greta Garbo was forced into retirement by the follow-up movie that was made by the studio. She wanted to make another historical drama and return to being Garbo. She didn't really like comedy that much. And there is some sense of straining when she, of course, except for the laughter and the phenomenal, the hat, and the parts that bring tears to my eyes. But they forced her into making a follow-up film because this was so successful and had 4 nominations for Academy Awards, with Melvin Douglas again, called Two-Faced Woman. And it was a complete disaster, complete flop, because she doesn't have comedy on demand. You know, she's not like Jean Arthur or a certain kind of classic golden era comedians. So she had quite a hard time. It completely bombed, and she retired at 35, and she really felt too old to be a star. 35, you know, you can't tell that to Glenn Close or any stars today, but we're in a different age, of course. But not until she was approached, I think, by Billy Wilder, obviously many years later, 1948, 49, inviting her to play Norma Desmond, the crazy Sunset Boulevard, washed-up actress, former silent film star. And he asked a variety of people. He and Brackett, who was the producer at that point of Sunset Boulevard, wanted, first of all, Mae West, because believe it or not, Sunset Boulevard was also supposed to be a comedy. Weird, but it was. And then Norma Shearer was asked, she turned it down. Mary Pickford is asked, she turned it down because she really was a crazy, reclusive silent film ex-star. Pola Negri turned it down, and Greta Garbo turned it down because I don't want to play like an ex-star who's no longer, you know. But Marlene Dietrich, boy, she had guts. And she wanted to work with Billy Wilder, and they made one of the greatest films about Hollywood. I think one of the greatest films ever made, Sunset Boulevard. And I'm glad that Mae West didn't do it, because Mae West was originally going to be paired with Marlon Brando, then Cary Grant, then Montgomery Clift. And when you're behind the scenes, which is kind of what my book is about, it's almost hysterical, the weirdness that goes on in the making of movies. And to try to imagine Mae West and Cary Grant in Sunset Boulevard, or Greta Garbo, indeed. But I miss Greta Garbo. I had a crush on her ever since seeing this film and bawling my eyes out at home when I was supposedly sick with the flu. But magic, strange magic.
So I'm very curious. You mentioned one thing earlier, that there's a couple scenes in this film that make you very emotional, and there's 2 scenes that make me very emotional. But I'd be very curious to hear what those scenes are for you and why.
Well, the laughing scene is extremely intensely emotional because of just the joy that she's overcome by, almost orgasmic joy for Greta Garbo compared to what she was like. The putting on the hat scene, it brings tears to my eyes. And I think just the relationship between them when they really are acknowledging that they're both in love and they're throwing caution to the winds. When she meets those 3 scoundrels again, that is a hysterical moment of joy for me too. And I think 3 or 4 times there are tears in my eyes, but particularly when the laughter of Garbo happens and she's trying on the hat, and she sits down and contemplates this transition that she's making as a person, as a human being. And Garbo did that very skillfully. And the laugh, by the way, was dubbed, if I'm correct. It was not her laughing, but the outburst that she had, she couldn't quite pull off that laugh. And it's kind of, again, behind the scenes weird machinery, but they dubbed the laugh. Everybody else, of course, was laughing hysterically. That was real. But that in itself strikes me as being very poignant. Let's help Greta laugh. Let's help her feel like a human being. So, I mean, it's filled with a lot of very kind of tear-jerking moments for me because of that tenderness. and just the sweetness of the film. I can't think of another film that's as charming and sweet, unless it's the follow-up film of Ernst Lubitsch, Shop Around the Corner, which I think is loaded with so much welling up of tears with Jimmy Stewart, and that Frank Morgan in that film is, to me, I think he's a genius, the owner of the shop. So when it comes to Lubitsch or even Brackett Wilder, I kind of transit, tears take me from one film to another, and I ride those tears, and they're often mingled with laughter. That's what I like about Billy Wilder, and I think Devin probably agrees with me that the fact that there's a mixture of tears and laughter, and in fact, one of the definitions for comedy that Brackett, I think, pointed out to a producer in one of their meetings when they were trying to explain how they thought Sunset Boulevard might be a comedy when it started out, his definition was one that he borrowed from Dorothy Parker, who was a friend of his from New York. The definition for comedy is tragedy plus time. Tragedy plus time. And that strikes me as in itself being a remarkably poignant sense of awareness. And both comedy and tragedy, in a sense, invented in terms of the theater by the classical Greeks. They mingled them together quite often too, and the masks of comedy and tragedy that we're familiar with, the sad and the laughing face. You don't really have one extreme without the other, which is why the best comedies to me have underneath a slightly heartbreaking tone, and the best tragedies have, like Sunset Boulevard does, raucous moments of weird, surreal humor. When you merge the two human emotions together, I think that's when we're most human, when we're laughing through our tears or we're crying through our whatever, living.
There's one of the two moments for me that really, I think one of the most beautiful things about old films, but especially Ernst Lubitsch's old films, is that, by definition, this applies to all old art. All art made before this present moment, which is all art. There's a new one made between when I said that now. But the best art for me is art that is dated because it can only have been made at the moment it was made, right? And that applies to this film, where it's made in right before the world was about to explode again, right before the Second World War. I mean, if everyone see that title card at the beginning that said, basically said, "This is pre-war, everyone." So, all the bombs and stuff, park those. But for me, that plays into one of the moments that most, makes me, made me at this time watching it here very emotional, which is when, at the big party when Garbo and Ina Claire have just had that sparring match where very brutal things have said, why'd they use whips when they could have used guns, that sort of thing. It's absolutely brutal. And then there's, that moment right after where Ninotchka is trying her best to kind of drink and dance and party her way through her tears. As someone who has, like any good Canadian right now, has been reading the news and has been spiraling a little about the state of geopolitical stuff, having the movie serve that purpose for me at that moment, that Champagne was doing for Ninotchka at that time was very, it was, that perfect, combination. A friend of mine once, they were speaking about Tony Erdmann, but I think it applies here too, that the best comedy acknowledges the tragedy and is all the funnier for it. And I think that scene is one of Lubitsch's greatest masterstrokes in that regard.
I think you're right, and I agree about the idea of films being dated. And younger people, I don't see any here, but they often might think they have difficulty, challenges with a film because it's dated. Well, it looks out of date, looks old-fashioned. That's the whole point. It's living history. And one of the reasons when I was 10 years old and I started seeing my family's name appear and then started seeing a variety of films, and then I became addicted and I started collecting 60mm films. I started having film festivals in my bedroom when I was still a kid, showing them on the ceiling to my friends who would invite over, and they had to have tickets. I just became completely addicted because I was leaving the time I lived in. And it wasn't a particularly bad time. It was the 1960s. It was a very fun time, as I recall. The parts of it I recall. And the fact that a film is dated is what makes it special. That's what makes Citizen Kane special, that it could only be made during that particular time, about that particular news tycoon. by that particular genius of a director who changed filmmaking. So I don't suffer from that feeling of classic cinema being burdened by the time in which it's made. In fact, I grew up also collecting silent films. For some reason, I love Erich von Stroheim silent films, Foolish Wives, Blind Husbands, Greed, the films that he made that were insane, over-the-top films in Hollywood. Silent films, I think, might be a challenge for young people. But I think any intelligent young person who's interested in history, maybe the history of Hollywood or films or just art, and the thing for me to remind people is that film is part of the formal history of art. It is art. And it grows out of a particular time after photography is invented in 1840, and then in 1886 or so, cinema, moving pictures happen. To me, when I'm looking at a film, I'm looking at paintings that are moving. And all the various parts, the moving parts, are visual art, so they're like paintings. And I think as long as you can identify the time in history when it's taking place, you can go into that time. This requires an imagination, though, skill, that I'm not sure young people have. And since there aren't many of them here, I'm not insulting them, but they are so super saturated by the information overload they have that they need to understand how it is to leave your body, what it means to leave your body and go into another time, such as the time we've just emerged from. Thank you so much, folks. It's been fun talking to you.
And thanks, Donald.
And thank you,
And
Don.
Tom.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much. I was hoping we would have time for a Q&A, but you were too interesting to cut off.
You mean long-winded is what you mean.
No, I don't mean. I will also say, I see some young people here.
Uh-oh.
I do. To me, anyway. You guys are young.